In the wake of Pearl Harbor, over 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of them U.S. citizens, were forced from their homes, stripped of their rights, and locked behind barbed wire. Not because of crimes they committed, but because of fear, prejudice, and hysteria. This is the story of when America turned on its own. Pearl Harbor and the rise of suspicion. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor changed America overnight. The surprise strike killed over 2,400 people and plunged the United States into World War II. But the attack also unleashed a wave of fear and suspicion that swept across the country. Suddenly, the faces of people who had lived in America for decades, farmers, fishermen, shopkeepers, students, were seen through the lens of potential treachery, simply because of their Japanese ancestry. In California, Oregon, and Washington, the West Coast press and local politicians began to call loudly for precautionary measures. Rumors spread that Japanese Americans were signaling enemy submarines with lights, hiding weapons in barns, or plotting sabotage. None of these claims were ever substantiated, but in the climate of fear after Pearl Harbor, rumor often carried as much weight as fact. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had already compiled lists of community leaders, priests, teachers, journalists, long before the war. In the hours following the attack, many of them were arrested without trial. Within days, the call to view Japanese Americans not as neighbors but as potential enemies became mainstream. The idea of loyalty was tied to race, and Japanese ancestry itself became grounds for suspicion. It's important to remember, nearly two-thirds of those who would later be incarcerated were American citizens by birth, Nisei, the children of immigrants. They spoke English, went to American schools, and many had never even visited Japan. Yet to a fearful public, ancestry overshadowed citizenship. The military and political establishment fanned these flames. General John L. DeWitt, head of Western Defense Command, famously declared, "A Jap is a Jap. It makes no difference whether he is an American citizen or not." That statement captured the mood. No distinction was made between immigrants and American-born citizens. This chapter sets the stage. Pearl Harbor provided the spark, but it was pre-existing prejudice, economic competition, and decades of anti-Asian sentiment that fueled the fire. The attack didn't create suspicion out of nothing. It gave justification to fears and racism that had simmered for years. Executive Order 9066, the legal foundation of internment. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. With a single stroke of the pen, over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, most of them U.S. citizens, lost their constitutional protections. The order authorized the military to designate exclusion zones and remove anyone deemed a threat to national security. In practice, it meant the forced removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast. The legal language was broad and vague. It didn't specifically mention Japanese Americans, but its intent was clear. German and Italian Americans were also technically covered, but only a tiny fraction were ever removed. For Japanese Americans, however, the order became an unchallengeable reality. Military authorities wasted no time. Posters appeared on street corners, nailed to telephone poles and store windows. They gave families just days to prepare, sometimes as little as 48 hours. Each person was allowed to bring only what they could carry. Imagine running a store, managing a farm, or raising a family, and suddenly being told to pack up your life in 2 suitcases. Everything else, homes, businesses, cars, personal belongings, had to be abandoned, sold at a loss, or left in the care of strangers. Local evacuation centers were established. Racetracks, fairgrounds, livestock pavilions. Families slept in horse stalls or hastily built barracks, waiting for transport to more permanent camps further inland. Barbed wire, guard towers, and armed soldiers underscored the reality. This was not resettlement, it was imprisonment. There was little organized resistance at first. Many Japanese Americans, still reeling from the shock, believed compliance would prove their loyalty. They hoped cooperation would shorten their time in confinement, but the legal system offered no protection. The Supreme Court, in later cases like Korematsu v. United States, upheld the government's actions, citing military necessity. Executive Order 966 remains one of the starkest examples in American history of how fear and prejudice can override constitutional rights. It transformed suspicion into state policy and marked the beginning of one of the most sweeping violations of civil liberties the country had ever witnessed. Forced evacuations, leaving home behind. Once Executive Order 9066 was signed, the machinery of mass removal moved swiftly. Families across California, Oregon, Washington, and parts of Arizona received notices declaring they were to be evacuated. The language tried to soften reality, but everyone understood this was forced removal. The process unfolded with military precision. Soldiers and local officials arrived in neighborhoods, posting orders with strict deadlines. Families had only days to sell homes, close businesses, or entrust their belongings to neighbors. Those who couldn't find buyers sold cars, furniture, and equipment at a fraction of their value. Some left keys with friends, hoping their property would be cared for. Many returned years later to find homes vandalized, land seized, and possessions gone. For children, the confusion was immense. They were pulled from schools mid-year, often leaving behind classmates who didn't understand why their friends were suddenly disappearing. Teachers and principals, in some cases, openly wept. In others, they offered little sympathy. For parents, the humiliation was sharper. Hard-working families who had built communities for decades were suddenly branded untrustworthy. Evacuation day itself was haunting. People gathered at designated points, churches, schools, bus depots, carrying bundles and suitcases, tags pinned to their coats with family numbers. Soldiers with rifles watched as buses and trains transported them first to assembly centers, temporary holding facilities. Some were marched past jeering crowds, others were met with silence from neighbors who had once been friends. This was the severing of community ties. Japanese-owned farms, especially on fertile California land, were taken over by others. Businesses that had thrived in cities like Los Angeles' Little Tokyo closed their doors, some never reopening. The economic loss was staggering, measured not just in dollars but in broken dreams. What makes this chapter particularly poignant is the ordinary humanity of those affected. They were not spies or saboteurs, but grocers, teachers, farmers, and students, yet they were uprooted en masse, marked by ancestry rather than evidence. The evacuation was not just a journey from home to camp, it was a journey from belonging to exclusion, from citizen to suspect. Life in assembly centers, from fairgrounds to barracks. Before the more permanent camps were completed, Japanese Americans were housed in temporary assembly centers. These were often nothing more than converted racetracks, livestock pavilions, and fairgrounds. The Santa Anita racetrack in California became one of the largest, where thousands of people lived in horse stalls that still smelled of manure. Life in these places was a shock. Families accustomed to privacy now lived in cramped stalls or hastily built barracks with no insulation. Thin walls offered no protection from heat, cold, or noise. Toilets and showers were communal, with no partitions stripping away dignity. Mess halls replaced kitchens, where lines stretched for hours, and meals were basic, canned goods, army surplus, little variety. Despite the grim conditions, people tried to create a sense of normalcy. Children improvised games in dirt lots, while adults organized makeshift schools and language classes. Doctors and nurses, often Japanese Americans themselves, set up clinics with limited supplies. Religious services were held in barns or outdoor spaces, offering spiritual comfort in uncertain times. But the emotional toll was heavy. Many felt shame at being herded into such conditions, as if their citizenship had been stripped away. Rumors circulated about where they would be sent next. Some feared deportation to Japan, a country many had never seen. Others worried they would be kept in confinement for the entire duration of the war. Still, resilience showed through. Community leaders organized talent shows, sports events, and newspapers. Artists sketched camp life, while carpenters built furniture from scrap lumber. These acts of creativity were not trivial. They were ways of asserting humanity in a system designed to reduce people to numbers. The assembly centers were meant to be temporary, but for the thousands who lived in them, they left lasting scars. Families who had once lived freely in cities and towns were reduced to life in converted stalls, awaiting transfer deeper inland. The message was clear. They were no longer trusted to live among their fellow Americans. Inside the camps, daily struggles and survival. After weeks or months in assembly centers, Japanese Americans were transported to more permanent relocation centers scattered across remote parts of the United States. These camps, Manzanar, Hart Mountain, Tule Lake, and others, were surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by armed soldiers in towers. They were not extermination camps like those in Nazi-occupied Europe, but they were prisons in everything but name. The locations were chosen for isolation: deserts, swamps, and plains far from cities. Families arrived by train or bus to rows of tar paper barracks, each divided into small rooms with little insulation. Dust storms blew through cracks in the walls, and in winter the unheated barracks froze. Entire families often squeezed into a single room, furnished only with army cots and a potbelly stove. Daily life revolved around regimentation. Meals were served at fixed times in communal mess halls, often disrupting traditional family bonds. Work assignments were handed out. Some became teachers, cooks, or farm laborers inside the camps. Small wages, just a few dollars per month, were offered, far below standard rates. Education continued, but under strained conditions. Schools were set up with minimal resources, taught by both internees and outside teachers. Some children thrived, adapting quickly, while others struggled with the stigma of imprisonment. Adults created clubs, sports teams, and even orchestras to bring a sense of culture and purpose. Yet, the psychological toll was immense. The barbed wire reminded everyone daily of their confinement. Internees often felt humiliation and anger at being treated as enemies in their own country. Depression and anxiety were common, though rarely spoken of. The dignity of normal life, privacy, autonomy, ownership, was stripped away, replaced by a constant reminder of exclusion. Still, many found ways to endure. Gardens were planted in barren soil, transforming empty landscapes into green patches of hope. Churches and temples were built from scrap wood, providing spaces for worship. Weddings, funerals, and festivals were held inside the camps, proving that even in confinement, life went on. The camps were not intended as punishment, but they functioned as such. They reshaped families, communities, and identities. For many, camp life became a strange mixture of monotony, resilience, and silent protest against the injustice of their imprisonment. Resistance and legal challenges. Though many internees initially complied in hopes of proving their loyalty, resistance soon emerged in different forms. Some resisted quietly, while others took their cases to the highest courts in the land. At Tule Lake, which became a segregation center for those labeled disloyal, open unrest broke out. Protests over poor conditions and forced loyalty questionnaires led to strikes and demonstrations. Military police responded with force, heightening tensions. The camp became notorious for its unrest, a stark reminder that not everyone accepted confinement passively. Legal challenges also tested the constitutionality of internment. Fred Korematsu, Gordon Hirabayashi, and Minoru Yasui defied exclusion orders, arguing that their rights as citizens were being violated. Their cases reached the Supreme Court, but the rulings upheld the government's actions, citing military necessity. These decisions remain some of the most controversial in American legal history, later criticized as failures of justice. Other forms of resistance were quieter, but just as meaningful. Internees organized petitions, wrote letters to officials, and published camp newspapers that debated government policy. Some resisted through culture. Art, music, and literature became vehicles for preserving dignity and identity. Even teaching children Japanese traditions inside the camp was an act of defiance against erasure. There was also resistance in the choice to serve. When the U.S. Army later called for volunteers, some Japanese American men refused, declaring they would not fight for a country that imprisoned their families. These no-no boys, as they were called, faced criticism both inside and outside the camps but stood firm in their principle. Others took the opposite path, joining the military to prove loyalty despite injustice. The spectrum of resistance shows that internment was never accepted without question. From open protest to legal battles, from silent endurance to cultural preservation, Japanese Americans found ways to push back. Their resistance, though often silenced at the time, laid the groundwork for later recognition of the injustice and eventual redress. Military service, the 442nd, and loyalty questions. In 1943, the U.S. government faced a paradox. On one hand, it had imprisoned Japanese Americans in camps. On the other, it needed soldiers to fight in Europe and the Pacific. The result was a controversial move, the creation of segregated units composed entirely of Japanese Americans. The most famous of these was the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, formed largely from volunteers and later draftees. Despite the injustice of their families' imprisonment, thousands of young men stepped forward to serve. Their reasons varied. Some hoped to prove loyalty, others saw it as a duty to their country, and still others sought to escape the monotony of camp life. The 442nd quickly distinguished itself on the battlefield. Fighting primarily in Europe, the unit became one of the most decorated in U.S. military history for its size and length of service. Its motto, "Go for broke," symbolized both its fighting spirit and its determination to prove itself against prejudice. Stories of their bravery, such as rescuing the Lost Battalion in France, became legendary. Meanwhile, loyalty was tested inside the camps through a controversial loyalty questionnaire. Two questions in particular, asking whether internees would serve in combat and whether they would forswear allegiance to the Japanese emperor sparked deep divisions. For many Nisei, answering yes was straightforward, but for others, especially those angry at their incarceration, the questions felt like insults. Some refused, leading to stigmatization as no-no boys. The contradiction was glaring. Japanese Americans were asked to fight and die for freedoms their families were being denied at home, yet their service left an undeniable legacy. When the war ended, the heroism of the 442nd became a powerful argument against the prejudice that had justified internment. The chapter of military service highlights the complexity of loyalty under oppression. It wasn't simply about blind obedience. It was about choices made in impossible circumstances, each choice carrying its own cost. The human cost: families, businesses, and communities lost. Beyond barbed wire and battles, the true devastation of internment lay in its human cost. Entire communities that had taken decades to build were dismantled in months. Japanese American farmers, who had cultivated some of the most productive land on the West Coast, lost fields, equipment, and harvests. Many never regained their property. Small businesses, grocery stores, laundries, restaurants were sold off at bargain prices or shuttered entirely. Families who had dreamed of handing down prosperity to the next generation saw those dreams vanish overnight. Children lost years of normal education. While schools existed in the camps, resources were scarce, and the stigma of imprisonment weighed heavily on young minds. College-age students faced interrupted studies, though a small number were allowed to attend universities outside the camps under special programs. The emotional toll was just as severe. Parents struggled with feelings of shame, while children often grew up questioning their place in America. Family structures frayed under camp regimentation, meals eaten in mess halls rather than at home weakened parental authority. In some cases, generational divides widened, as older Issei clung to traditions while younger Nisei tried to adapt. Communities once vibrant with culture, like San Francisco's Japantown or Los Angeles's Little Tokyo, were hollowed out. When families returned after the war, many neighborhoods had changed beyond recognition. Homes were occupied by others, businesses replaced, and trust eroded. Neighbors who had once been friends sometimes turned away, embarrassed or complicit in the losses. The cost was not only financial but deeply personal. Dreams were deferred, trust in government shattered, and an entire generation left with scars that could not be easily healed. Some never spoke of their internment years, burying trauma in silence. Others dedicated their lives to ensuring it would not be forgotten. This chapter underscores the point that internment was not simply a temporary wartime inconvenience. It was a life-altering event that reshaped the futures of over 120,000 people. The echoes of that cost would be felt for decades, long after the barbed wire was taken down. Closing the camps returned to an unwelcoming America. By 1944, as the tide of war turned in favor of the Allies, pressure mounted to close the internment camps. Court cases, shifting public opinion, and military reassessments all played a role. In December 1944, the Supreme Court finally ruled that loyal American citizens could not be detained without cause. Soon after, the War Relocation Authority announced that camps would begin to close. But release did not mean freedom without consequence. For many internees, leaving camp was as daunting as entering it. They had no homes to return to, no businesses waiting to be reopened. Some discovered their farms had been seized for unpaid taxes. Others found strangers occupying their houses. In cities like Los Angeles, neighborhoods once filled with Japanese-owned shops had been taken over by new tenants. Hostility lingered. Returning families faced vandalism, harassment, and even violence. Signs appeared in storefronts warning "No Japs allowed." Jobs were scarce, and employers often refused to hire Japanese Americans, branding them as disloyal despite their sacrifices. Many were forced to start from nothing, taking menial jobs, living in temporary housing, and rebuilding lives piece by piece. Yet resilience defined this return. Churches and community organizations helped families reintegrate. Cooperative groups pooled resources to restart farms and businesses. Veterans of the 442nd, returning with medals of valor, became powerful advocates for their community, challenging the prejudice that still lingered. Still, the scars were deep. For children, the return meant grappling with lost years of education. For parents, it meant the painful recognition that decades of work had been erased. Closing the camps ended the physical imprisonment, but it did not erase the stigma or the injustice that Japanese Americans carried back into society. Redress, apologies, and lasting legacy. For decades after World War II, the story of Japanese American internment remained largely unspoken. Survivors often stayed silent, focused on rebuilding their lives. But as the civil rights movement of the 1960s and 1970s grew, younger generations began demanding recognition of the injustice their families had endured. Activists, veterans, and community leaders pushed for government acknowledgement and reparations. They collected testimonies, organized campaigns, and educated the public. Their efforts culminated in 1988, when President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, a formal apology on behalf of the U.S. government. The act acknowledged that internment had been driven not by military necessity, but by racial prejudice, wartime hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. Survivors received symbolic financial compensation, but the apology carried deeper meaning. It validated their suffering and restored dignity. The legacy of internment continues to resonate. Museums, memorials, and oral histories preserve the voices of those who lived through it. Writers and filmmakers have told stories once kept in silence. Schools now teach internment as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how easily fear and prejudice can override constitutional protections. Beyond history books, the lessons remain urgent. After 9/11, debates about profiling and civil liberties evoked comparisons to 1942. The internment experience stands as a warning against collective punishment, urging vigilance whenever fear threatens to erode the rights of individuals. For Japanese Americans, redress was never about erasing the past, but about ensuring it was remembered. Their legacy is one of resilience, resistance, and the insistence that democracy must include all its citizens, even in times of crisis. This final chapter closes the story, but its echoes remain alive in every discussion about liberty, justice, and the dangers of fear-driven policy.